Welcome to the Cedar Falls Committee of the Whole meeting this May 6, 2019. I'll now call this meeting to order. We have 4 items up this evening for discussion: the Panther Lane no parking request, the river gauge and gates, Red Cedar update, and bills and payroll. Start off with the Panther Lane no parking request. I believe our staff, Dave Search, is up for that.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Tonight I just want to go through some research the planning staff has been working on last few weeks regarding a possible on-street parking restriction along Panther Lane. And that's the segment, the southern segment of Panther Lane, basically from the pedestrian bridge over Dry Run Creek to the south dead end. We did some research. I sent out a survey end of March to everyone in that segment just to say, hey, what's your thoughts on this? Do you want a parking restriction, no parking restriction, east side, west side, both sides? We got that survey back, we finished our research, and then I sent another notice to those people just to kind of give them the results of that, and I'm going to go over that here in a little bit. That letter went out to those property owners last Friday. I did get a notice or an email today, and that's in front of you, from someone that couldn't attend tonight's meeting. So with that, I just want to kind of move along with the show here. Just some specifics for this segment of Panther Lane. Again, south of the pedestrian bridge on the north end, and then down to the dead end on the south. It's roughly 1,600 lineal feet. It's a standard street width, 31 foot, back of curb to back of curb. Parking is allowed on both sides of this street, with the exception to that north end. On the east side, there's a parking restriction on the east side, no parking on the east side from the north end down south past Starview Drive, and there's a little gap there on the west side. I think that's just kind of more of a clearance from the intersection there. So that's been in place roughly since 1991, and so that is still there. And again, this is a standard residential street with a 25-mile-an-hour posted speed limit. Just moving along, again, I sent a survey out to everyone along this segment of Panther Lane, roughly 25 letters, 24 letters, and you can kind of see, if you can see the dots shown up there, majority of them were no change. You can see a lot of green dots there on the east side and then down more of the south end. No parking on the east side, which is, you can see a few there on the east side. There's one on the west side for a parking restriction. And then the 2 dots that are in red, they indicated they'd like to extend that parking restriction to the south there down to Springbrook Drive. So just kind of taking all those factors in, we would like to look at putting a parking restriction on the east side of Panther Lane, basically extending that existing restriction down to Springbrook Drive. From the pedestrian bridge down to Springbrook Drive, kind of keeping that little gap there on the west side there at that intersection. But we took a look at that, you know, again, there's a pedestrian bridge on the north side. I think there's some keeping that in place, just allow those vehicles to move. I believe there's a lot of pedestrians that use that stretch. There's no sidewalks in that area, so they do walk up and down the street and cross a pedestrian bridge on that side. And it's kind of a logical break as you look at a parking restriction. Instead of kind of in the middle of the lot, it's more down to an intersection. And again, there's support from all those property owners there along the east side. And that's, again, from the pedestrian bridge down to Springbrook Drive. So it's that north 1 block per se.
Thank you, David. Any questions, comments from Council? Mr. Brewer?
I just wanted to add that it was kind of a unique problem because of the large amount of property on Starview Drive that has multiple vehicles, and that those were parking out onto this area, which was creating problems for those residents in the area where he's talking, with them unable to get in and out of their driveways or access to their mailboxes.
Anything further from Council? Mr. Cruz?
Similar to what we've discussed, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, if we block off a section for no parking right at the end there, then it's just going to move all the vehicles further down into the other streets, Springbrook and so on. I think if we're seeing commuters coming in for campus, that we should look at something like resident-only parking as opposed to just eliminating the parking, as we could do in other parts of the College Hill area. Resident-only parking is used very effectively in other college towns, and I could give some examples for staff to review. Particularly Dubuque has about 5, 6 different zones for resident-only parking. But if you get rid of the commuters, then you'll have room for the local people that want to park there.
Yeah, the problem isn't commuters in this area. It's the
That's what-
residents
well,
off of Starview.
I'm reading off the letter from this gentleman that just came, and let's see, while has been more frustrating is that the street seems to be regularly used as a parking lot for students walking to campus. And my experience in the College Hill overlay is a lot of people drive in anywhere close to campus that they can get, and then they walk to school, and then they come back, and then they leave. So,
Mr. Blanchard, if I may, before we go further, just in the sake of our process to allow time to have staff, not the public yet, to have staff look, Mr. Cruz mentioned he wanted limitations and have residential parking only. I want to take that up as an amendment, because that is going to then have research capabilities towards the staff and spending their time in that based off of moving away from what the staff recommendation was. If council's okay with that, I have an amendment from Mr. Cruz to have the residential parking only as well as the staff recommendation. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Motion and second, I'll discuss for that amendment. Any further discussion from council?
Are you talking about selling a permit then? That they have to have a permit to park?
That would be determined by staff if you wanted them to take a look at that.
could I respond?
Sure.
Typically, resident-only parking does have areas that are limited to residents, and you prove your residency by getting a permit at City Hall, and it's good for certain areas, that sort of thing. It's used extensively in larger cities and denser populations where you've got destinations where people tend to go to, and they don't necessarily want to get parking permits on campus or various things like that, and they utilize what they perceive as free parking on the street, which it is free, but it impacts the residents in that neighborhood. So I could provide a copy of Dubuque's to start with, and there's others that you can look at.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Because there's an amendment added at this point, I will open it up for folks if they want to come speak with this since action is being taken by the council. Anyone want to come up and speak? Sure, please. Just take your name and address for us, please, and make sure that microphone's right there too for the folks.
Guess what? I live on Panther Lane. Thank you. Carol Shelton, 3528 Panther Lane. First of all, I would like to be positive, and I'd like to thank our councilperson for taking our request, researching it, giving it to Mr. Sturch, who did a wonderful job of sending out letters and corresponding with us. We are very satisfied with what they came up with. What you need to understand, Mr. Cruz, is the people who we would like to have removed from Panther Lane are residents who refuse to park in their own double driveway and double garage. They prefer to be on the street because they can be out faster. So we were delighted with the research and the results that you were going to take it off from Springbrook all the way to the bridge. We like that. Not that I want to fight your amendment, but I just want you to know who's parking there and creating the problem. It originated because they were parking in front of mailboxes. And both my husband and my neighbor get a lot of medicine delivered by mail. And often the mailman wouldn't stop and get out of the mail truck and deliver it. So we hope that would alleviate this. In a perfect world, they also would not park on the west side because they are overpopulated on Starview Drive. One house has 6 renters. That means 6 cars. They can't possibly fit in a single driveway. They've remodeled the garage to be a bedroom. So they park on the west side of Panther. To be positive, I made a cute little sign and laminated it that said, "Please do not park behind at the end of my driveway." And we put it under their windshield wiper for 2 guys. Both of them returned them to the front door and said, "Thank you, we won't do that." Others, those 2 quit, others took their place. If I have to do it again, I will add to the other side of the note card that says, a 77-year-old fat lady lives here who backed into her own garage door, hoping that that will raise a danger flag and they'll move somewhere else. You'll have to deal with the west side of Panther Lane in whatever way you see fit. We're just telling you we're pleased with Springbrook to the bridge. Keep your mind open about the west side.
Great.
Anybody have any questions for me? As a homeowner, we're good?
You're good.
Thank you.
Carol, appreciate it. Anyone else pertaining to this topic in our discussion? I'll bring it back to council. We are discussing the amendment for residential parking only limitations. Any further discussion from council?
Mr. Mayor, I'm not so much seeing the need for the amendment, and I don't know if it'd be appropriate since Councilor Dara had seconded, if you might have some additional info for why he would support that amendment.
Just an
He's
opportunity to
supporting the
hear,
discussion.
Oh, okay.
just to hear the discussion.
Sorry, okay.
Anyone further from council?
Well, I guess for myself, Darryl, you brought this up a couple times, and I'm not opposed to us reviewing that, but it seems like maybe goal setting might be a time when we could really take a bigger, broader look at that versus on this particular one. I don't live there. I don't know exactly what's going on with the parking, but I do see some validity in resident-only parking in other neighborhoods too. So, and I don't believe, as long as I've been on the council, we've never discussed it.
Yeah.
So,
I'm just basically responding to this comment from this gentleman here in this letter that points out that it's regularly used as a parking lot for students walking to campus. Now, they could be resident students, as was stated, or they could be commuters coming in. There might be a little of both. I don't know.
Sure.
So
Sorry?
there's a lot of details to resident-only parking, and that's maybe ancillary to this whole discussion about what to do with this little section, because that's kind of a big beast.
Very good. Mr. Board, did you have?
I was just going to point out that at sometime in the future, perhaps at goal setting, if we did talk about permit parking, maybe you'd use a whole zone such as the overlay zoning ordinance, although this area is not in the overlay.
Be very pertinent if council wants staff to move that forward during goal setting as we normally do in that season. If there's no further discussions, all in favor of the amendment, say aye. Hearing none, I'm assuming the rest are opposed. That does not carry. I'll go back to the original motion from staff. It's been-
Motion to approve staff recommendation?
Yep, it's already been motioned and seconded. Any further discussion on the original? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you very much. And thank you, David and Carol. Moving on to the next topic is the river gauge and gates. I think we have Chase coming up.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor, Council. Some of you may recall back in March, we had a referral to take a look at the river gauge and the dam operations and maintenance side of it. So tonight, I'm kind of tag teaming with Brian here. I'll cover the river gauge portion, and then I'll turn it over to Brian for the operations and maintenance. So just a little background on the river gauge. The river gauge that we currently have, it measures the elevations, the volumes, gives us predictions and outlook for the future, and obviously the weather. That is operated by the United States Geological Survey, also called USGS. In that picture there, you can kind of see it's basically a 2-foot by 3-foot box that stores all the equipment, and then a conduit runs down to the river and provides that monitoring system. There's two types of river gauge is offered by the USGS, and that is a stage-only gauge, and that only measures the current river elevation. It doesn't do anything else, doesn't provide us with any additional information, just the current river elevation. And then there's the full river gauge, which displays predictions and volume and other information. That's currently what we have. Those bottom two bullets is kind of a little bit of history of Cedar Falls. We had a manual gauge that was operated by a phone system that you kind of had to call in to get the river predictions. That was around the 1999 timeframe, and then we switched over to the automated gauge around 2009. A little information on the agreement and cost with the USGS. The annual cost is approximately $15,000, and that's split 60-40 between the jurisdiction and the USGS. That amounts to just over $9,000 that the city of Cedar Falls contributes to that. The agreement covers the periodic inspection. I think that is a 6-week inspection that they do, and also the data entry and yearly maintenance on the equipment. The bottom of the slide there kind of represents the two types of gauges and the cost to install them and the annual cost afterwards. Our current system is that one on the lower right. Both have similar installation costs, but the full river gauge has a significant annual cost thereafter just because of the equipment and the data entry that is involved with the river predictions. So this slide here shows our current river gauge where it's located. It is on the Highway 57 or West First Street Bridge. It is attached to the bridge structure. And this kind of shows you a general corridor of the river as it passes through Cedar Falls. So this last slide here that I have kind of summarizes the river gauge, and I've had many conversations with the USGS over the last few weeks. You know, given that the corridor that we have and such a short distance that kind of passes through Cedar Falls here and has impacts, they would not suggest adding an additional structure upstream of our current river gauge. They're not in support of it. Obviously, it would be 100% Cedar Falls' cost to do that, whether it's a stage-only gauge or a full river gauge. You know, there isn't any tributary streams that add to the flow. The projections would be the same as our current river gauge produces. So that's kind of where it was left with the USGS. And I guess I would encourage any property in Cedar Falls that's affected by water elevations by the river to sign up for the USGS automated services. You know, most people have a cell phone or email by now, and those come out every hour. And I know that there's city staff that have that software or email system that, you know, during these events, anytime it gets over a elevation of, say, 87 or 88, that we're notified at every hour. And it's very helpful for us to try to plan for things that we need to do for an upcoming event or see where the river's going to be in the upcoming stages. So I guess that's kind of the river gauge side of it. I'll turn it over to Brian, but before I do that, I guess I'd like to open it up for questions about the river gauge specifically that any of you may have.
That would be fine, Mr. Miller.
What kind of a structure, have you given that any thought, would this need to be placed on?
Like what it looks like?
No, there isn't anything up there. There's no bridge that you could attach an additional
Correct.
gauge
And,
to, so
and yeah, those discussions have been had with the USGS. You can place them without a bridge structure. It's a little more difficult and may add a little additional cost above and beyond the $15,000, but traditionally they like to attach it to a bridge structure. So,
would
you know,
concrete pier or?
that's where the conduit kind of runs down the pier, but they want to mount that box that I showed on the first slide up and out of any potential flood stage. So, you know, in our case, above 105 or 106. So if it were to be mounted just out in the open, it would have to be significantly off the ground.
That cost is not included
In the 15.
in the 15. So, and then as well, $5,500, if you do this, the river stage only, the $5,500 annual cost, what is that? Is that for the USGS to maintain?
Yep, they'll still do the 6-week periodic inspection, and then that involves data entry as well to keep the software up and running, to provide us with updates. Basically, that'll be similar to what we currently have. You can get online and be able to see what the actual water elevation is at that time. And I'm sure it updates every hour, the same as our current system does.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cruz?
So you mentioned that USGS is not in support of this idea, so there is no cost sharing?
That's correct.
Okay.
Anyone further from council with Chase?
Just where is the next gauge up? Is it Janesville?
There's one in Janesville. There's one in Finchford. The rivers kind of join about 5 miles north of town. The West Fork and the Shell Rock River join. There is not a gauge there. And then there's some tributary streams from where the rivers join. We have the Beaver Creek from the west that produces some flow. So, you know, the further down we get and closer to Cedar Falls would be the more accurate information.
Anyone further? Yes, Mr. Green.
Is it safe to say that the full river gauge is something we want to stay with, that there's value in that data and we wouldn't want to downgrade?
Oh, I think definitely it's only going to get better in time with technology and measurements they can do given the watershed that we're in. So I think the information is very beneficial to us.
If in years to come we look at further river improvements that have been discussed, is that something that would then alleviate the ice damming as part of the benefit?
Brian's going to touch on a little of that and future improvements on possible city projects, but you know, ice jamming is kind of a natural thing that, you know, every community kind of has to deal with. So I think there's some areas where we could improve, yes.
Why don't we make the switch now and just be close by there, Chase, in case more questions come.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. I'm going to focus more on the operation of the dam, the maintenance and operation of the dam that we deal with at Parks and Public Works. First, I want to give you a little bit of history just to kind of touch on the fact that when the dam was originally built, it was not built necessarily for flood control. It was built more for the mills and eventually hydroelectric power. So in the mid-1800s, you can see that it was built as a brush dam and the mill race at that time was developed to create a water direction for these mills to operate. And then eventually we had hydroelectric power. In 1934, the dam was rebuilt to provide the hydroelectric building with the water to power it for power for the city of Cedar Falls. And that's basically the structure that you see today is what was built in 1934. In 2007, that particular structure was taken and upgraded with modern electric lifts. The Tainer gates had new seals and bases established. A lot of work done underwater to recreate the seal for them Tainer gates, and then there was a lot of structural concrete repair that was done. Some of the head walls and some of the columns were rebuilt. So again, I want to emphasize that back in the day, that was more for redirecting water for the mill operations and the hydroelectric operations rather than for flood control. Today, it's basically used as a deterrent for higher water levels initially until we reach such a level that they're no longer an impact or no longer provide any good to open. So the general operation, the gates are open systematically beginning with the farthest gate out. We have a policy that we follow from the DNR for opening and closing gates. It's not something we need to contact them with on a daily or a regular basis when we open and close these gates, but it is a guideline that we have approved by them, and that was done back in the 70s by the Director of Public Works at that time. So once we get all 4 gates open, that's basically the amount of activity that we can perform in controlling the river level. And then when we go to close the gates, we just basically reverse order. We go from 4th gate, which is closest to the shore, and we systematically close them back to number 1 and eventually all closed. The picture you see here basically depicts what we look for when we're looking for that river level. That's pretty close to where we like to be when we're manipulating that river level, that impoundment. So that kind of shows you where we want to be. And the policy actually states there's a portion of the dam structure that we kind of look at to gauge that height, but we found that this is a good gauge for us to measure by. Again, when we open gates, we're not just opening them willy-nilly. We were making sure that we're doing this based on that policy, and then we're also keeping our water reclamation staff involved and informed about what's going on so that they can take action downstream at some of the gate wells when necessary. Some of the challenges that we face with the opening and closing of these gates and monitoring that pool is a lot of tree impacts that we have, flooding of the river and trees that float down. We get a lot of driftwood stuck in the gates, and that causes more trouble when we're going to close the gates. A lot of times they'll lodge in there, and we have difficulty getting the gates to close, which sometimes will create more reduction in the impoundment. We've been successful for the most part in getting these dislodged. Last year, we struggled with the picture on your left. That tree that was in there stayed there most of the summer into the late fall and almost winter before we were actually able to get that one out. It was well under the water line and very difficult to see, and we were finally able to snag it and lift it up out of there. Other challenges, of course, the behavior of the river has changed dramatically, and as we know, we had a fall flood of 2016, which was our second highest recorded, and then we also had one this last fall, which was a top 10 flood. And then again, early spring, we had a top 6 flood, I believe it was. One of the major challenges we faced there was getting the gates open because of the freezing in the springtime. The gates simply froze to the point where they would not move. The water came up early enough in the year where we still had full ice on the river. And you talked about the ice dams that we had. They weren't necessarily created by the Tainer gates. The impact of the ice was up further, and it actually dammed up further upstream than what we were experiencing here. But once that did let go, we had quite a bit of ice going through the gates. It took us probably 2 weeks to get the gates fully open, to get all 4 gates open during that flood event. And part of the reason for that, if you look at this picture, you'll see how the face of that gate, the downstream side, is totally exposed to the elements. When we had the sub-zero freezing, we had the polar vortex that occurred over the wintertime, the impact that the ice created wrapped completely around the columns where our gates are mounted to. And I wish we could have got a picture of it, but when we did finally get that last gate open, there was a sheet of ice that went from bottom to top. So who knows how far upstream that freezes when you get the cold weather that you have throughout the winter. Like I said, the behavior of the river's changed such where we're seeing the late fall and the early spring floods, and we're having a difficult time managing them gates because of that. Our basic DNR operating requirements, and this is more for altering the impoundment rather than controlling the impoundment for flooding. Just to point out, the impoundment, what these gates will control or what they impact upstream is basically when you get to Black Hawk Park, between the campground and a little further upstream, that's about the impact that our gates have on the Cedar River. So in other words, if we were to drain that river, you wouldn't see much more of an impact upstream of the campground at Black Hawk Park. Most of that is from Dead Man's Island down to the gates where you see the impact our gates create. So if we wanted to modify that, we wanted to reduce that impoundment for whatever reason, then we have to have a signed DNR approval. You got to submit a plan to them, and then you have to tell them the reason why you're doing it, and then there's notification that has to be given not only to the public, but to those that are impacted along the river, whether it's upstream or downstream. And then there's certain requirements that you got to meet when you're reducing. You can't reduce that impoundment more than half a foot per day, and you can't refill that more than half a foot per day, and you can't reduce the CFS lower than 650 at any given time. So in other words, if you had the impoundment drain and then you closed all the gates, you have no water going over the spillway, and you basically drain the river, and that's not allowable. So you have to watch that very closely if you do drain the river for whatever reason, and refill according to DNR policy. Winter operations, some of the options that we're looking at possibly to kind of mitigate our problem with the freezing with these early spring floods. There's I guess, two options, and I mentioned the one to open the gates fully prior to the aquatic hibernation. And that occurs typically late September to mid-October. So anything that was done to alter that impoundment would have to be done before mid-October. The positive side of that would be that the gate operations are maintenance-free throughout the winter. You'd open them and you would just forget about them until spring when you could come in after the ice is out and close them down. How much ice would you have to wait for? How long would you have to wait for that ice to melt? I don't know. We've never done this before. The negative impact would be affecting the fall river recreation. There's a lot of people that fish up there in the fall, a lot of walleye fishermen. There's still a lot of river life before the river actually freezes. And then again, you've got to be very conscious of the aquatic life, the mussels, the fish movement, things like that, where they move to for winter, because you're basically draining that down to a narrow stream if you take the impoundment completely out. Another option, and this is one that I think would work for us. However, we have not done this one either, but I think this stands a good chance to succeed, to reduce the amount of ice, and that would be to crack the gates this same time, early October, to get the water bubbling, to get that turbulence created, and to reduce the amount of ice that can build up. You're still going to get ice buildup, but you may not get, you shouldn't get near the amount that you got if they're completely closed. That should have a less impact on aquatic life, but again, the negative side is there's no guarantee the gates will not freeze and be non-functional if we had a high water event early spring. Long-term solution, as Darrell mentioned earlier, is that we're looking at some river improvements, and one of those would be phase 2, which would possibly mean that we're going to take the gates out, or removal of the gates could occur. So obviously that would be a good long-term solution for not having to deal with the maintenance issues. So I know Chase had a recommendation on the river gauge, but I'm going to back up here, and the recommendation that we're going to go with on the winter operations is to look at them gates, open them slightly in the fall. Obviously, we would have to write a plan for DNR for this because it's going to impact that impoundment slightly. We don't know to what degree that would occur, but we would impact the impoundment, so we'd have to get DNR approval, do the public notice, and things of that nature. So that's kind of what we're looking at doing. That's our recommendation, to try to lessen the impact that them gates have for spring flooding.
Thank you, Brian. And just to be clear before discussions begin, basically, Chase, the recommendation that you brought forward really is to do nothing.
Correct.
Okay, so I don't know.
Structure and don't add any.
Right. I'm just making the council aware of that as we do discuss. Open it up for questions for these two gentlemen. Mr. Blanford?
Mr. Keith, I'm just wondering, I like the second option you presented with trying to create some artificial turbulence for that. I think you and I may have discussed Rue briefly at the time. Have we looked at any other communities in the northern part of the United States that may have harsher winters as far as what do they do with their dams? Is there anything else that we could do to try to prevent that unnecessary freezing?
This particular dam, back when it was originally built, had a large air compressor shed and a large air compressor that injected air into bubblers, is what they called it, and it made that turbulence similar to what we're trying to replicate with opening the gates. I'm sure there's other methods of heat tape or heating the gates to some degree to lessen that impact as well. I haven't done any research per se on that, but I do know that there's some of them options that exist.
Thank you.
Mr. Green?
Mr. Mayor, would it be possible to shelter the gates at all, like over the top? Or is that ice really just building up from underneath?
Like I mentioned, when that when you get to freezing temperatures, it basically freezes from the face of that gate, downstream side, back into the upstream. So I don't really think that sheltering would be an option.
Mr. Cruz?
So Brian, this happens pretty much every year because we have sub-zero temperatures. It's just a matter of how quickly in the spring it lets loose or breaks loose and starts going under again.
That's correct. And like I said, the behavior of the river has changed such that we're seeing later floods in the fall and earlier floods in the spring.
So my next question is going to be, have we seen something like this recently or in your knowledge, years with the city? How often does it happen adverse or dramatically adversely like it did this year?
The spring flood of 2019 was the first time that I've ever experienced in my 35 years of operating the gates that we could not get them open during a flood. I mean, we've had lesser floods where we've had them stuck and, eventually they popped open, but never the duration that we spent trying to get them open for that week's period of time.
Mr. Miller?
I'm sure you're gonna have to take a guess here, but pounds of force before, when you were trying to get those gates open, we kept blowing breakers. So if we kept that turbulence going, your best guess would be that they would be able to raise the gates no matter what, I would assume.
Yeah, we're hoping that there'll be less ice buildup, and therefore, when it starts melting or we start getting more, if river rise, that it'll create more turbulence and be less of an impact when we're trying to open them.
I think you mentioned this as well. Ice damming can happen anywhere. I mean, certainly some of this was due because we couldn't get the gates open, but upstream, I mean, there's a potential for that every year for folks that live on the water, right?
Yeah, and this year, that ice dam occurred just north of, or just upstream of Island Park, and if we actually viewed it from the south side of the river, and you could see the water go in two directions. It was going down the first slough to the south side of the river, and it was going straight north, and then turning and going down Cottage Row and down the creek on the north side of the river. So it was basically had the river stopped and shoving it both directions.
Sure.
Anything further from council? It's been motioned, as you see there. Is there a motion and second before I open up to public?
Which one are we?
Open slightly in the fall is the one that's on the table.
Motion to approve?
Second.
Motion second. Any further discussion from council? I know we have some folks here from up north. If you want to come say a few words, you're more than welcome to. You got nominated. Just your name and address, please.
Steve Smith at 2528 Cottage Row. Thanks for taking up our concerns. I cannot speak for my neighbors. We've not had no chance to discuss this, but it seems to me that a gauge only upstream would provide some benefit for us. We'd know a little bit more about what the river level is where we live. And we're more interested in that than what happens below the dam. The bottleneck that's created by the various episodes of the past 40 or 50 years or so have greatly increased the flooding upstream of the dam. Just knowing what the river level is there would provide us some helpful information, it seems to me. Having to do with the gates, that's a great frustration of ours because it directly impacts our daily life and our property and all that kind of thing. And it's a frustration that, that the gates have been there for 80 years and we can't open them. It doesn't make any sense to me. Leaving them open a small amount makes a great deal of sense to me. The gates then couldn't freeze to the ground, and the forcing of the water under the slight opening of the gate would seem to me to lessen its inclination to freeze up the face of the gate. That seems to me to be a very good idea.
Right. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Anyone further? Then motion second. Sure, bring it back to you, Mr. Miller.
Brian, have we had any discussions with the DNR on the recreation side of that? It wouldn't even be with the DNR in that regard. I guess I'm a little concerned about leaving those gates open and the impact it has. And I don't want the recreation side of it to take precedence over people's safety in terms of ice dams or whatnot, but just curious if you've had any discussions with residents or...
The discussion I had with fisheries from the DNR was that they basically recommended not opening, or you're going. What they said was you're going to get a lot of pushback if you open the gates all the way. I think if we're going to open these gates slightly, we're going to see a reduction in that impoundment, but we're not going to see to the extent that it's going to be drained out. We'll still have a decent sized impoundment that you can still recreate on in the fall or late fall, early winter. Throughout the winter, when it ices up, there's a lot of recreation with snowmobiles and things like that. And I think you'll see the aquatic life is a lot safer with that method.
Okay.
Mr. Cruz?
The ice dam that happened this year, was it because of possible logs or log jams that developed that then held back the water and ice and caused this pileup? Or what would have?
I really can't speculate, but a lot of it was just pure ice. It was just
Dredging?
the
or
river
anything?
coming up, breaking that ice bond or the surface ice, and then it all comes together at some point where it hasn't broke yet, and then it just stacks up on itself. And then that brings with it, anytime you get all that ice, it brings with it trees, it brings with it docks, it brings with it, as these folks know, it's a lot of danger.
Anything further from council?
Just to clarify, all that's on the table right now is the gates, correct?
Yes, the gate's slightly open.
Yeah.
Yep. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chase. Thanks, folks, for coming.
Are we doing anything with staff recommendation on the gauge?
There's going to be two motions, one for the one I have up here on the gauge and then Brian's.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, thank you. So there is now a motion to leave it as is.
Leave
We can
as
read it
is.
there.
Yep.
Not to install the additional structure. Is there a motion for that, please?
So
So
moved.
moved.
Motion second. Open that up for discussion. Mr. Miller?
My frustration with this was that we couldn't get accurate information to residents, whether on Cottage Row or whether in other areas of North Cedar or throughout the community that, I mean, there were some folks, I believe, where there was 2 foot of difference. And I get that it only happens sometimes, but I do feel like if we're not going to do anything with a gauge, we still have an obligation to folks to get accurate information out there. And if our gauge is not accurate, what can we do? Is there a notification system? Is there something else? I guess I'm somewhat sensing how a vote's going to go here, but we have an obligation to people to get accurate information out there. This river's part of our community. People have lived around this for how many years, and if what we have is not accurate, then what can we do as a community to make sure that people can get accurate information?
Mr. Barr?
Was the gauges not accurate because of the frozen gates, and will this opening of the gates create this gauge to be more accurate?
That's tough to say. I have had conversations with the USGS on the elevation fluctuation during ice jams, and they can see up to 12 to 18 inches. They've seen communities have where our current river gauge downstream may say it's going to be, or it's currently at a 90, but upstream people are experiencing a 92 maybe. And that can be from many factors, whether it's ice buildup or something's not functioning correct with the equipment. But we haven't had any trouble with the equipment that we have. It was just this current ice situation this spring.
Mr. Cruz, did you have something? Sorry.
Prior to gauges of this style that we have now, wasn't there just river spotters of some sort that would see an ice dam being built up? I mean, back in the day, whenever the day was, that
I would say that's the case. I mean,
because if you
it's
can,
easiest to think about it when Janesville has, or I know at Nashua had a big one this last year, but when that ice breaks loose and it's on the surface and it breaks loose and we have a foot of ice and it ends up falling in the water and becomes buoyant, it's like basically like throwing ice in a cup. I mean, that's what's happening. And it's hard for them to predict, if you have 10 inches here and you have 12 inches in these other communities, to predict what the river is going to do. It's different than predicting an inch of rainfall in a certain watershed. They can predict that.
so then if you couldn't have enough gauges out there then in some ways to detect all the tributaries and streams coming in, how I would possibly look at it. I'm just thinking of a point, I know on the Mississippi, you have people up and down the river, and you can see when there's a huge jam that's developing, people talk and spread the word, and I don't know if that's something that can be done informally or if there is a process for that.
Mr. Blanford.
Chase, I guess, what is the USGS's solution? I concur with Councilman Miller's concern. If we're giving people a quote on river elevation, it better be accurate. So what is their solution to us, or is it they have?
Sure, I mean, there's always the potential to add, and, it becomes, how many to add, and where's the most beneficial location. There's a lot of technical logistics that go along with the gauge. Our current gauge is based on the elevations that you see, the 90 or 92, that's what we all know, and then our flood response plan is based on that. It crosses Cottage Row at 88, elevation of 88. Well, if the GIS, the GPS datums can't coordinate with each other, which I'm assuming this new gauge will be on its own datum, it will have different elevations. They won't reference ours. So upstream, it'll say flood stage is
14 feet.
90, not 88. So then there's going to be differences in those, and you're going to have to relate them together. You're going to have to interpolate between the two if they can't coordinate.
Mr. Wheeler?
I'm just curious, what is the accuracy of our current gauge, plus or minus what?
It's different in every event,
But
obviously.
any gauge has an accuracy equivalent to it.
Yeah, and I don't know what that is. That would be a question that I could ask USGS.
Anyone further? Mr. Miller?
I can see, I get both sides of it. I mean, my frustration is there aren't a number of tributaries out here that are affecting this, and if there was a gauge placed below Deadman's, I think as was first suggested, that gives everybody in the neighborhood an opportunity. The water was almost coming over Clare Street at the height of this ice dam, which doesn't happen at the 95-foot level that it was showing. There's a whole neighborhood there that's affected by that. I talked to a gal that lives on Lone Tree that the road got blocked a foot or 2 foot before. The gauge was showing something. She ended up needing it. I mean, that's everything in somebody's basement if that information is not accurate. So that's my frustration, is there's a very real impact to a lot of people in this regard. So if this doesn't pass, I sure would like to make sure that in the event that if we find ourselves in this event again where we know there's an ice dam out there, that we have some type of a protocol with our flood plan, that Benton's is contacted, the folks on Cottage Row are contacted to let them know that that gauge is not accurate, because
River spotter.
you can't pick one person and say,
Well,
we're going to have a
multiple-
river spotter on the
A
flood.
network of people, but just,
But I agree, you can do that, and I think the folks on Cottage Row do talk amongst themselves as to what's going on out there, but for everybody else, those folks on Clare, the water was crossing and blocked one of my routes well before it normally does, so I don't think the river gauge is, maybe that's not the only option, but I sure hope that we do a better job of letting people know that that number is not accurate, because everybody bases their flood plan off of that gauge.
During these types of situation, I said it earlier, but I would encourage any property affected by the river elevations, sign up for this free automated notice, and you can input, everyone is customizable to what elevation you want. If my properties get affected at 84, I set it to 82, and then every hour I'm notified, and it's not like the river comes up in 1 hour. I'll see it's 82.3, it's 82.5, 82.7. I know it's coming up, I can see it, it's sending me these messages. And I think that would help.
But Chase, what is that
individual
based
properties.
off of?
The gauge.
That is the current gauge downstream.
So that's not going to help the solution, that's not solving the problem we just talked about. We're saying it's not
Personal
right.
responsibility to everybody that lives on the river.
Because everyone's property is going to be different. As I said, as you go upstream, those elevations change. It's not, the elevation of 88 of Cottage Row, for example, being affected, that's when the water goes over it. If you go up by Black Hawk County Park, it's not 88 up there. It's a different elevation. As you go upstream, the elevations change.
And you can pinpoint that through that app? Per
No,
property?
That you cannot. You'd have to have a stage-only gauge at that exact location.
Gotcha. And the reason I would like that is because in this case, all that water was diverted to Snag, and there was or Cottage Row. So that would give those folks and other residents of the neighborhood another alternative. And I get what you're saying, that there may be some confusion that is sparked because of that as well. Because, you know, for somebody that moves to the neighborhood that doesn't know, you know, this gauge, they think they're getting the gauge below the dam, and it's the other one. But there's certainly a personal responsibility here for everybody that chooses to live around the water, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to get accurate information to people. So I don't know what the right course is, but I'd like to see the gauge installed.
Mr. Cruz?
What source would we get the money from for this to install and then ongoing?
That would be up for discussion. I think I didn't look into it at this time, but that would be something that we would have to.
And I guess I was,
It could be a myriad, correct, staff? It could be probably 4 different funds.
Well, I think we would like the capital cost, the initial cost is something we probably put on the CIP and either use capital projects or bonding fund for. The annual cost would probably be something we would then budget in, like the engineer's budget, which would be, come out of the general fund budget each year.
Is the existing one paid in that same fashion?
Yes.
There was a comment, Mr. Green?
well,
I could
Oh,
see
sorry,
a
thank you, next.
stage-only gauge as just an insurance policy for upriver. I mean, that seems reasonable to me.
Mr. Adair?
I guess I thought I heard Chase say, but he didn't know that there was a good place to put it.
Yeah, I know there are some city-owned properties that were purchased with the flood buyout, but again, location is key, because if you put it maybe midpoint along the river there, adjacent to Cottage Row, people upstream and downstream, you know, a quarter of a mile are at a different elevation, so.
I will open this up for at least procedurally, and staff help me out, because the motion is to do nothing. It would take, if you want to see what the other side looks like, it would be an amendment to do something, if you want to go that route. Otherwise, there's a motion and second to move forward with staff's recommendation. Any further discussion?
Well, I'd make that amendment.
The motion by Mr. Miller to amend to allow for, what's the other one called?
It's a
Stage only?
stage
Stage
only.
only.
Second.
Motion and second. I will open up for further discussion if we want to go this route. Anything further?
There's still a concern, I think, as to what that gets mounted to. You know, we don't have any bridges up, and I think, what was the reasoning for the location that was originally mentioned by Deadman's, or below Deadman's?
You
because
want it
of-
as close to the community as you possibly can, and obviously, the further you go upstream, kind of around Dead Man's Island, the stream goes, kind of wise off in 2 directions. You have the main channel, and then you have another channel. But obviously be below the Beaver Creek, which is a tributary that comes into the Cedar.
Anything further from council? Mr. Cruz?
Just bringing up a point earlier, I mentioned that if we put in another gauge, we may know reasonably accurately 2 points, but then we have all the tributaries coming in that we still don't necessarily know accurately. I mean, how many gauges can you put in to satisfy the entire?
I mean,
There's-
the Beaver might have an ice jam, but the West Fork doesn't, and one breaks loose at a different time, so it's,
Still in a location that residents that live right there can get information on.
True, but I'm looking at the fact that when I said river spotter, I didn't mean just one person sitting there. I mean, it's a network of people that notify each other that, hey, there's an ice dam on Beaver, there's one on some other fork, and be alert, because how many gauges can you put in? I mean, you put in one more,
Right.
I mean,
I see your point. I
I-
think there's a
I'm-
fair amount of communication, at least on Cottage Row,
Right.
similar to what you're talking about, but Still the
Boer,
accuracy, sorry.
No, it's okay, Mr. Boer.
It seems like it might be something that we could add to our communication specialist position, is to communicate when there's this ice jam problem to the residents that are concerned or that want to. And as far as that free app that you mentioned, how does a person sign up for that?
There was an email a month or so ago that I sent out that had that link in there, and I can provide that again. It's directly to the USGS website, and you just input your information and what elevation you want to be notified at, and then it'll notify you thereafter.
Thank you.
Mr. Dare?
Just along with all of this, I think Mark's comment earlier too about having a bit more of a discussion to establish some kind of protocol, whether individuals want to follow it or not, at least provide suggestions to the public as to what to do in these circumstances. I mean, add a gauge, but then are there other things that homeowners should be taking more responsibility for, and at least throw that out there for people to think about. I think sometimes, seems to me, we've been really good at reacting to the floods, but really haven't done much proactive, and this would be at least something along those lines.
Anything further from council on the amendment? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Help me out, Kevin. So to not install is now off the table?
Yeah, so you have to go, let's see, they just approved an amendment to add a gauge, which really nullifies no gauge. What's left, though, is information about where it's to be placed and that kind of stuff. You could add to the, a further amendment that asks staff to study it or come back with a recommendation or something like that as to placement, letting, the councils let staff know they wish to have another gauge, but we're not clear where it's going to go yet.
So moved.
That'll just naturally happen when we bring the agreement back.
Sure. Okay. But then, so are we done then as far as from the original?
We are.
Okay, very good. It asks us to add a gauge then and for the discussion when the motion comes or the idea comes from staff. Thank you very much, everybody. Moving next is the Red Cedar update. Danny Lodick is here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And I've been told often that I'm long-winded, so I'll try to not do that tonight. And nice to meet, well, Rob, as you before, Daryl, I don't believe we've had a chance to really meet in person, but nice to meet you in person. So tonight, really, we just wanted to get a chance to get in front of everyone and give an update. This is the second year in Red Cedar now, so we really wanted to show what we've worked on this last year, what we've accomplished, and then give a quick insight into what we're building for this next year. So, and like I said, I'll try and be brief with it. The first thing we really wanted to do last year is, a lot of this work we're doing is undefined. There's other organizations that do similar work around the country that we've looked at for best practices models, but a lot of this, especially the model we brought together, there's no one that replicates it exactly like we have. So we wanted to look at, okay, what are the problems? Where are there, in that whole process, and you can see up on this slide, one of the first things we looked at is, in creating a new product, a new business, a new service, what are all the stages people go through, the milestones, and we kind of used everything from seeing the opportunity in the market and seeing that there's a problem we can create a solution to about $1 million a year in revenue. And that's kind of an arbitrary number, but when we're trying to define startups, we had to try and bucket that somehow. So what we found is there were very recognizable milestones that every company, every startup, every founder goes through as they're trying to build a company. And these were just 6 different stages that from other places we've researched we found were pretty recognizable ones. And you can, if we go through quick, ideation, just seeing the idea, coming up with a potential solution to a problem, validating that it's a real market opportunity, prototyping it, what does that solution look like, market entry, actually getting your first real customer. A lot of times people use the term MVP, but just realizing, or meaning, has somebody actually paid you for your product? Then product market fit, you're starting to get traction with it, and then establishing kind of that scaling stage of you've built a repeatable process. So we looked at this, and because I always like to show off my spreadsheets, because everyone's always impressed by colorful spreadsheets. So really we wanted to start digging into this analytically and say, okay, of all these steps, all these stages, as we're working with founders, people building new companies, where are people getting stuck? What resources do we have in place currently between funding resources, programming, programs at the universities, SBDC, the Main Street programs, I know this is a little bit hard, you can't really see all the individual titles. We started actually bucketing all these and saying, okay, where do we have gaps? Where are we seeing that, okay, people are hitting this roadblock and then they're just not moving past it? Anything I can help with, Jim?
What's that? You're good.
Okay. So, for example, the seed fund that we launched last year was really from identifying there was a big gap in a certain piece of the funding area. So, and I know you saw this when we did the original presentation, but I wanted to show, we also have been taking a look at, beyond just those steps at each milestone, we're looking at all the components that go into fostering new startups, creating new companies, really looking at about 15 different capacities we have as a region that help us create new companies, spin off new companies, get new startups going. Risk capital, business acumen, entrepreneurial capacity, softer things like bigger community issues, quality of life, government policies. And this is where those regional partnerships with UNI, Wartburg, the cities, universities, economic development, we've been meeting formally this last year to really look at, okay, as a region, these things take a long time to address. So how are we working together to make sure between all of our capacities, we can look and say 10 years from now, we are objectively better at helping build companies than we are now. So, because we like sticky notes, so one of the first things we did with all the big players at the table is we sat them down and said, okay, these 15 capacities, everyone quickly go up and put a 1, and this is with all the universities, colleges, cities in the room. So put a 1 on each of these capacities that you think is your role as an organization to address. It's your primary reason for existing. And a 2 if you think it's something we kind of do, but it's not really our primary role. And in about 5 minutes, we were really quickly able to realize, you can probably see there's a little bit of a gap there. But those 4 squares kind of in the central bottom left are everything that deals with sourcing new technologies, new products out of the existing industry, companies that are here. And then we were able to see kind of an allocation of who's addressing which issues. So really quickly, we were able to get a sense of where do we have gaps, where do we need to see improvements. So going forward, some of the key things we learned from this last year, one is that from a startup perspective and looking at that whole spectrum of seeing an opportunity to getting $1 million a year in revenue, the biggest area we saw that we need to do a lot of work on is we don't have a lot of people trained around here that think like founders, who see opportunities in the market and know how to build sustainable business models around that. There's a lot of people that are incredibly technically skilled. You know, it's the Midwest, we're problem solvers, but there's not a lot of people that actually look at opportunities and understand how to build a business model around that. So that was one of the areas for our role at Red Cedar we wanted to focus on. Second is, a lot of the first-time founders that we've talked with, it's usually not an issue of not knowing what to do or one big thing that made them fail. And everyone's got their to-do list of the 500 things they need to be doing, but the biggest issue most people face is prioritization. Most people just did the wrong thing, focused on the wrong thing at the wrong time, and either ran out of money, ran out of time, or just ran out of passion to keep putting up with it, to keep going. Third was, as a region, when you look at a lot of the other communities that have successful startup communities, really a lot of the innovation and new startups are coming out of some research base. If you look at Ames, it's ISU and AgTech. If you look at Des Moines, it's insurance products, financial technology, largely because of their industry base. If you look at Iowa City, it's health tech, pharmaceutical. We as a region undoubtedly have the largest concentration of manufacturing. We have a lot of expertise at the university. I know Randy's here. We've worked very closely with UNI on identifying what are some of the areas that we have to dig into our technical expertise and start sourcing some of those ideas. And that last one that goes with that is better engaging the existing industry base. The average age of a founder of a company is actually 42 years old nationally, 46 years old for high growth founders. Most startups are not just coming out of college students, or not people sitting around just trying to come up with an idea. It's usually someone who's in an industry, who sees the problems, and who has the knowledge and the industry wherewithal to be able to do something with it. So we needed to work on pulling more of those people out from the industry we have in the area. So getting to how this first year we really, we started all this knowing why we were doing it. And this last year we really wanted to identify, okay, how are we operationally, sustainably, and repeatably going to do this? So this quick, just to give a sense, this was from our strategic plan for this next year. 50% of our work is going to be founder focused, because we realized that's where the role we play is. We were founded by groups of company founders who saw a need. And a lot of the people that we're trying to work with are the founders themselves. So 50% of our programming needs to be focused on founders, helping them learn faster, accelerate their growth through those stages, and making sure they have access to the connections and resources. 30% is that regional innovation piece, those big 15 components that we're looking at and realizing these things take a long time to address. It's not one of us, we've got you and I in the room, Viridian's in the room, the city's in the room. But we realize these things take a long time. There's city policies that come into this. There's roles with the university, with R&D and tech transfer. But we're being very intentional about the conversations we're having with that regional innovation network we put together. And then 20% is addressing the gaps. The seed fund was an example of, we saw a lot of the companies we talked to just struggle to find early stage funding. They either got connected with someone who didn't understand their industry, they gave up too much of their company because they don't understand how to value a company. No one understands how to value a company, honestly. But it's messy. So the seed fund was saying, okay, there's not currently a way for entrepreneurs to access early stage capital. How do we address that? So 2019, two of the big programs that we're going to be launching, especially on that founder focus piece, is one, the founders cohort. So when I said a lot of entrepreneurs and startups aren't failing because of one big failure, it's usually just prioritization. We found from a lot of the people we've talked to, we've been trialing this for about the last 4 or 5 months, just doing monthly peer groups of other founders at early stages, facilitated by a founder who's been through it. So if you guys are familiar with Vistage, with the YPO groups, the Young Presidents Organizations, there's a lot of peer groups for people. Vistage is about 16,000, 17,000 a year for membership. And the YPO groups, I think you have to be over $1 million a year in revenue before you're allowed to join. There's a lot of peer groups for successful founders, but we found there's not peer groups for early stage founders. And most people just need access to a peer group of other founders learning through it. So our goal with these groups and this cohort isn't just the group itself, it's to build networks of founders. For example, then too, for us, we've been trying to look at sustainably. We can't sit down with every startup, with every founder one-on-one and try and see what connections they need. So this is a way for us to group them together and once a month just see what their needs are, what connections, what resources, who can we refer them to that has the expertise they need at the time they need it. So we're currently trialing this with 12 companies. We originally got them all together, but then we started to see some segmentation. Okay, these 5 should be together, these 5. And we're currently working, for example, with Community Main Street to specifically look at how can we facilitate peer groups for Main Street first-time business founders to make sure that they have access to a network of other people that makes it more likely for their business to be successful. And then with this cohort, we're also pooling resources, including discounted access to Millrace for the early stage companies. We're working with HubSpot, it's a CRM system, but we can get 90% off their software for any startups we're working with. We're working with CFU and provide discount gigabit internet for any of these companies that we're working with. Our Champions Network is a network of a lot of the companies in the area. Bergen KTV we're working with. They've agreed to donate several $1,000s a year worth of pro bono in-kind support for financial projections and accounting for early stage companies we're working with, as well as curating a specific package for new startups that says when they should hire a bookkeeper, templates for their accounting, templates for their budgeting, so that we can start getting that to founders earlier. And the second is a program called Co-Starters, which I believe you have the materials for in the packet. Co-Starters is a national program based out of Chattanooga, and essentially the program, the way they talk about it is it's a 9-week program, their core program, that meets once a week, but they say it's about training founders. I think I've got the slide. So if you've ever seen the Lean Business Model Canvas before, when I say training founders, what we're talking about is being able to look at the problem, and I always use the example of a graphic designer. They can look at a piece of design and say, okay, if we use this typography, they understand color theory, typography, layout, design. They can look at the thing and just say, this is how it should be designed to look good, to work well. Founders typically understand revenue streams, cost structures, the channels they can use to access their customers, what's the value proposition to their customers. When you talk to people that have founded multiple companies, started multiple things, they talk like this. Like they look at an opportunity in the market and they say, like, well, we can go talk to this guy, we can get to him through this, we can use this revenue structure, we've done it like this before, and they have the network to do it. So this program, they said don't look at it as people enrolling. It's a 9-week program. They enroll, they go through it, they're trained on this, how to identify their customers, market segments, channels they can use. They learn this canvas. They said don't look at it as company enrolls at point A to get point B. They said if you do this quarterly with about 15 people a cohort, they said look at this as training 60 people a year in your community to think like founders, to have that skill set. They actually do close 20 to 30 cohorts of this in their community every single year. And if you have heard of some of the stuff Chattanooga is doing, they've been very successful with a lot of this work. Co-Starters is also one of the most respected community or ecosystem startup building organizations in the country. They're doing a lot of work with Kauffman Foundation, so a lot more than just this program. They're a very key partner in some of the work we've been doing. So our implementation timeline for this, we're currently working through the licensing with them, and also talking with the Main Streets on this, on can we do these cohorts specifically for retail type companies? Can we do this specifically for, a lot of this program was actually built originally to teach artists how to build sustainable business models, and then they noticed software companies were signing up. New startups of all different kinds were signing up, so they scaled that model beyond that. So in June 2019, we're looking at the initial 2-day training where they come in, they train our facilitators, they train us how to implement it, and then they also help us bring together a larger conversation around this work. Summer 2019, licensing this, there's also some one-day workshops we can do with it, different models. But then this fall is when we'll be launching the first cohort and partnering with a lot of different keystone partners like the universities, the colleges. We've talked with Wartburg, Hawkeye, with the Main Streets about funneling anyone that's starting a new business, a new product, to get into this so that we're training people how to learn to do this stuff faster. Am I past my 20 minutes yet?
You're close, buddy.
So quick then by the numbers. Just wanted to throw this in last. So we currently have just over 100 people working in Millrace Co-working. Represents about 30 different companies that we have there. And that's everything from game development companies, architecture companies, web design development, digital analytics. I could keep going, but don't have time for that. We launched the seed fund last year, and we met the 10 investor minimum we were going for. So we've got about $200,000 of investable capital in that. We have an 11th investor pending in it. We made 2 investments in 2018, Terra Oak and Stratifolio. And I can get more details for those companies if you'd like. We hosted over 20 companies pitching at events like 1 Million Cups, and we've been much more intentional about using events like that to help build a funnel of when we meet with someone, they have an idea, we help them get ready, then we get into something like 1 Million Cups where the first 2 companies that got invested in pitched it that first, which is where some of the fund members had a chance to see their presentation, see what they're working on, and then get them into the next stage of that investment. So currently, we're working then directly with those 12 different startup companies, and those range from a company that's almost $1 million a year in revenue currently, who needs more strategic connections to move from a service-based model to a scalable product, to pre-revenue startups that have a product that has some IP with it, an actual patent they have with it that was one of the companies invested in.
Thanks.
Otherwise, I'll just open it up for questions.
You got anything for Danny? Mr. Green?
Yes, so I heard about a lot of the stakeholders in the area. I didn't hear the Cedar Falls Library mentioned. I was curious if you have any relationships with the library looking to pursue that for books for entrepreneurs right downtown.
We haven't. And now you mentioned that, I would actually be interested because as we've been doing these peer groups, books get brought up a lot because peers love to say, you should read this book. And we have, between the group there, usually they're like, here, I've got a copy, I'll let you borrow it. But there's a lot of it that I've actually thought, can we budget to get these books? But if that's something the library might already have access to those books, that could be a really good partnership because it seems like the act of buying a book is usually the key time inhibitor for people because it takes them about 3 weeks to ever go and buy the book, even though it's a great recommendation to read it.
Or you go sit and read it at Barnes & Noble.
Exactly. Who would be the contact there now to reach out to?
We can sure get you in contact with Kelly Stern, the director there at the library. Danny? Yeah.
Deal.
Great point. Anything further from council? Thank you, Danny. Thanks
Thank
to all
you.
the
Well
stakeholders
done.
in there as well. Appreciate it. Last item, council, is there a motion to allow for bills and payroll?
So moved.
Second.
Motion second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We'll now wait till the top of the hour for our regular city council meeting. Thank you.